We have been consumed by a malevolent narrative that has replaced our souls, our transcendent selves, and turned us into consumers, debt slaves, or in the words of Alex Sakaris, biological robots living in a meaningless universe. The money myth is one of the few, and maybe the most powerful universal narratives. The reality of money is based entirely on the unquestioned belief in the story of the dollar. But how many of us really know what money is and how it is created? If we dare to question the established worldview, we must re-envision our reality and create our own myths. Our future as a species depends on the quality of the questions we ask and the stories we tell. It really is that simple. We have reached the twilight of the Archons, and it's time we began to write our own stories, forge our own identities, and liberate ourselves to our highest destinies.
Hello everyone, you've just been listening to clips from the documentary film Twilight of the Archons, produced by today's guest, Robert Bonomo. Robert came on the show a couple of years ago to explain the origins of money and its corruption in the modern financial system. He returns today to discuss his documentary, where he looks at these issues through a gnostic spiritual lens. Robert also lived in Russia for a number of years, so I asked him his perspective on the current goings-on there.
I've always been fascinated with money, and then I've been very interested, I would say, in the last 3 or 4 years in Advaita, sort of the non-dual path.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make something that somehow connected the two. And that was really the inspiration, to come up with a film that talked about money, spirituality, and somehow tried to bring them together. I'm not sure if I was successful, but that was the inspiration behind it. And I began that before COVID.
Right.
So I had finished the first section before COVID. I had to trash the whole thing and start over again because the world was just too crazy. I'm like, how can I finish this film with all this going on? Like, it was too much. So I stopped and then I started again and I finally got through it. So it was
just to make sure the listeners coming along with us, when you say money, you're really talking about a financial control grid, and the word Archon being this power, this ruler not of this world, some kind of force that's lording it over us.
Exactly. In the cultural sense, the monetary, the financial sense, and the spiritual sense. And that was the one thing I tried to weave in there was it's very similar how we can get sucked into, if you think from a non-dual point of view, who are you actually? It's kind of the question no one ever asks,
Mm-hmm.
That question, well, exactly, who am I?
The most and least obvious question, it seems.
And it's also the same question with money. What is this stuff exactly? You know what I mean? It's a question that nobody really asks. So that was really, it was those two questions that I thought, well, maybe I can weave them together. And that was sort of the inspiration.
Yeah, it's funny. I probably told you this last time, but I remember sitting down as like a 14-year-old, and we had, I don't know, we meant to be doing a textiles class or something. And I just drew a little map out of a village and tried to understand, like, okay, let's say 100 people move to an entirely new town. And you've got your butcher, your baker, your candlestick maker, you've got your teacher, and you join all these different professions. And somebody makes the money, where they're going to have a government to maybe do the roads and create the money. And I kept thinking, how are they interjected? Because they could just create all the money and hand it to people. But that wouldn't work, because who knows what it's worth and how much is a butcher's time compared to a baker's. And I really thought this should be simple. And it wasn't until 15 years later when I just happened across Murray Rothbard's The Mystery of Banking. And in 20 pages, literally 20 pages, he explained it. Like, no, it's a thing. Like, it could be any commodity that then it gets this useful function of, like, you want eggs? No, I don't want eggs. You want eggs? So no, we don't have that. Oh, we've got this metal here that's that's valuable. So that's not going to perish. So we'll exchange that as to loosen up that barter system. And yeah, just like clear as day. And the thing that shines through is the state is not involved in this. There is the thing I thought, absolutely, it must be the government's job. I mean, the Queen is on every banknote here. It must be the government. They must do that. How could you have different competing currencies? Everyone prints their own money. It's crazy. And then to see that, no, the state isn't involved in this at all and can't be involved in the creation of it. Yeah, that was, but the most elemental question. And I think that's what struck me at the time. Is like, well, there's not a class on this. Everything else we don't do a class at school on where money comes from. That's weird.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. Are you familiar with modern monetary theory?
Yeah.
Now, the MMT folks would argue with you. They would say you're completely wrong. Without a state, there is no money. And they make an interesting argument. It's worthwhile to look into what they say, because for them, it's a sovereign tax credit. That's all money is. It's just a tax credit. Anything else are money flavored marketing tokens. That's the terminology they use. Money flavored marketing tokens. Sounds a lot like quantitative easing to me, but I've gotten a lot of debates with them. There's some things about them that I find really interesting, but sometimes they will not accept anything but sovereign tax credit as money. So you tell them, for example, for them, gold is not money. Bitcoin is not money.
Right.
I got in a really interesting debate with, it was a professor. He was arguing that Bitcoin is not money and can't be money because it's not a sovereign tax credit. But I said, well, in El Salvador, now you can pay your taxes in Bitcoin. He said, okay, then in El Salvador, it's money.
Right. That's a strange definition. I mean, in a sense, I don't understand it well enough that I could get on a stage and explain what it is, but I have sort of a basic understanding. And I guess from their perspective, there's a truth in that, the money, that kind of money, fiat currency, couldn't work without the state. And I remember watching a debate with the Austrian economist Bob Murphy, Professor Murphy, debating a modern monetary theorist. And I think Bob was setting him up for a kind of 1-2 punch. He was saying his big point, and then the guy just walked right into it. Bob's point was this whole thing requires violence to back it in some sense. It requires a man with a gun somewhere to force you to take these tokens. And before Bob got to that point, the modern monetary theorist came out with that straight away and said, oh yeah, of course, like these tickets, they could be valueless, but if there's a man with a gun at the door, then suddenly they get value. And Bob couldn't quite believe it. It's like, you've just made my, but he didn't see a problem with that. He didn't see the problem. Oh, because the state can legitimately use violence to force people to use the money with the picture of the monarch on the head or the president.
Exactly, and they make a good point. And if they know their history, the MMT folks, and they will give you a history of money showing you that most, like, in England they use those sticks where they would cut the and then they would break them.
Tally sticks. Tally sticks. Yeah.
There's a word for them. I'm escaping me, but they it's a very interesting argument, and I'm not here to say I'm the I know I'm going to give you the answers. They make a good argument. I like some of the things they say. However, with what's going on in the world today with inflation, especially in Turkey, because Turkey did something very MMT-ish, is when they lost control of the lira, usually you raise interest rates. Mm-hmm. The MMT people believe all interest rates should be at zero. And Erdogan dropped them. He dropped interest rates. And initially, the lira recuperated, but now he's completely lost control of it. Inflation in Turkey now is about 70 or 80%.
Wow, right.
And the lira is just losing it. And so it's sort of the moment of truth for MMT. They always say a little inflation is okay. Ask people in the UK now, what's inflation now in the UK?
I don't know. It is ridiculous.
High.
Yeah.
The latest numbers came out that were ridiculously high. So it's a very interesting moment for these theories because, okay, inflation's okay. Ask
well, it's interesting because I would say a lot of Austrian economists, pure free market economists, predicted a much higher rate of inflation coming out of the 08-09 financial crisis. Right. And that didn't materialize. There were even bets made that were then lost by Austrians. And so what I glean from that is, we have a theory of like the business cycle and so on, but it's kind of harder to say like how that actually plays out in the real world. Then you can't make predictions for what prices are going to be on the shelves necessarily. Yeah,
if you want, I can give you I can sort of tell you what happened there.
Yeah, please do. Yeah,
sure. So when they began quantitative easing, remember, quantitative easing is when the central bank goes out in the open market and buys assets from other banks. This stays within what are bank reserve accounts at the Fed. What happened with all that quantitative easing money? You know where it all went? Almost penny for penny into assets. So if you look at the S&P 500, was there no inflation in the S&P 500? from 660 in March of 2009 to where is it now at 3,500?
Right.
See what
okay.
I mean?
Yeah.
So it all went into assets. So there was asset inflation.
Okay.
Now, it's very interesting. And if you look at this, it's very hard for people to understand. We are in an environment in the world that's incredibly deflationary, massively deflationary. Technology is deflationary.
Yeah.
Demographics are deflationary. So you have the deflationary push on one side, and then you have the monetary policy on the other, and they're fighting each other. But what we're seeing right now is really a lot of American stimulus checks, because those checks didn't go to central banks. They went to people. And what did people do? I mean, the government gave people a ton of money. They spent it. So you have a massive increase in demand. Supplies messed up because of COVID. Supply chains were messed up. And people's the way people consume has changed. They stay at home now. They're not driving around, going to restaurants and bars. So the whole supply chain doesn't even fit the new demand. So that's what's going on now. And it's really,
that's the right thing to do when the government gives you money, isn't it? Is to spend it as quickly as possible, because you're getting your stuff before the prices inevitably inflate.
Especially if there's inflation. Yeah. So yeah, it's a very interesting moment for all, I think, economists, because now we're starting to see very, very big movements in lots of different places. And anyone tells you right now they know what's going on. If someone comes out and says this was going to happen, I think it's one of those moments we don't know what's going to happen. Are we going to fall into a serious recession with deflation, or are we going to get into some sort of stagflation? It's hard to tell. It's really hard to tell.
So going back to the documentary, then, with the use of the word Archons, what's your meaning when you use that word?
It's really the gnostic meaning of the Archons. So in the gnostic sense, you have the demiurge who's and there's a god above God. Then you have this demiurge who's sort of either malevolent or sort of neutral, and who controls the world are the Archons. You could think of them as sort of the planetary gods. They do his bidding, and they keep us constrained on Earth in that gnostic sense. We're sort of chained here in this prison.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was using of the Archons, because, and I make the point in the film that the real Archons are us.
Right. Okay.
We're our own Archon. That's what I played a little bit of a game, because I'm sure some people were watching it saying, "Oh yeah, it's Bill Gates, or it's the Illuminati." And then I try and flip the script a little bit and go, "Look, you're your own Archon."
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's a word that works on, I think, different levels, because I've no doubt the Archons exist, but I'm not sure exactly what they are. So on one level, it is the Bill Gateses and the people on the control. And you go beyond that, maybe you can say Archons aren't people or things or spirits or anything, but they're the structures we set up. And then ultimately, you end up looking in a mirror and seeing, as you're saying, I think that's the last level of insight.
Egregores, maybe. Who knows what the hell they are, But they're in our minds. They're definitely in our minds. And I think that's it's a really interesting question, because actually I was speaking with some Russians that I know, and a lot of Russians now think that there's this sort of Illuminati group in the world that's just hell bent on destroying Russia. Like that's what's happening. And I lived in Russia, and I remember asking them, well, where we live, I don't want to go into the place because but is there corruption here? And, we talked about some events where, people died and the levels of corruption. And I said, is that the Illuminati, or is that, you guys? And did you stand up to any of this corruption? And when these people were killed, did you guys say, this is wrong? There was one case, very serious corruption where many people were killed. And I wanted to write an article on it. And people just said, don't do it, please. So I didn't, because I didn't want to get people in trouble. But I remember I told them, I said, you told me not to write that. And I said, the people who did that, were they, was that Bill Gates and the Illuminati, or was that your society, your culture doing that to yourselves? People don't like that. Because that nobody wants to say, yeah, it's the house we built, and this is the way we built it, and it's fucked up.
Yeah. Well, we see that in the West right now. I mean, George W. Bush is just on this thing that I'm sure you know, as I say, it's hard to believe it's not deliberate. Where he's a brutal invasion of Iraq. I mean, Ukraine.
I thought it was a joke, or that somebody did some weird thing with like the voice. I had to watch it 3 times. I live in Tunisia, so people aren't real fond of George Bush, and they look very poorly on the Iraq war. And we were in the teachers' lounge, and people were just rolling over. I mean, it was just hysterical. Yeah,
and I'm not sure if he understood what he'd done or not. If it occurred to him the irony of the situation, he just seemed to be water off a duck's back. I don't know.
It's really incredible. I've often wondered from a moral kind of point. Did you see Oliver Stone's film on W? Did you see that film?
Not the one on W, no.
It was pretty interesting. I mean, there's a point where you see him kind of, drinking his milk and going to bed at 9 o'clock, and that sort of the moral. I mean, imagine living with that, knowing it doesn't seem to faze a guy like that. You don't see it kind of. No.
No, it's inside. I mean, I remember listening to an interview with St. John Hunt, the son of E. Howard Hunt, the CIA officer who was the principal architect of Operation PP Success, the overthrow of the government of Guatemala in the 50s. And St. John is very insightful, the family members and children of CIA officers and people like that. And St. John Hunt said his father was telling him about this and how he was down there and he was fighting communism. That's why he did it. And he said, Dad, like 14,000 people died in that. Don't you feel bad? Said, no, not at all. No, it's collateral damage, national security. That's it. Who cares? It just didn't faze him. Didn't faze him in the slightest. It was far more than 14,000 as the years rolled by. But no, it's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is kind of extraordinary. But on the other hand, do we need people like that? Maybe we do. I mean, if humans didn't have that capacity, would we have survived?
Yeah.
As a race, as Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
That's on the other side of the question too. So maybe that's just part of who we are. I don't know.
Just picking up then on what you said about living in Russia, you were there in Russia and Ukraine for around 5 years.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I never lived in Ukraine. I've been there, but I've never lived there. I was in Russia from on and off. And it's interesting, the dates from around 2008 till I think I left 2016. But there was a period there where I was in China. I lived in China for about 2 years. But that was an interesting period because in 2008, something very important happened, which was the war in Georgia. So something changed there, and you could see people change, and there was a very big change, of course, after 2014. A very big shift.
Right.
In Russia, and so it's a very interesting period to see. People's relationship with Putin changed a lot. When I first arrived there, people looked at him as a politician. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say there was this kind of cult of personality, and that evolved. You saw that evolve. Quite powerfully.
I found the war in Georgia interesting. I was trying to understand it a bit more recently for obvious reasons. And there's 2 narratives of that war in the West. The one is the one that I would imagine is predominant in Russia and the kind of anti-war movements in the West, that Russia was essentially engaging in a humanitarian intervention to save the South Ossetian people from being massacred by the Georgians. I imagine that's predominant in Russia. And then you get the more neoconservative line on it as well. No, this was all set up and the Georgians were responding to this aggressive Russian incursion. So essentially the same 2 narratives that arise now about Ukraine are mirrored back in 2008. What was your sense of it being in Russia at the time and the Russian people's image of what was going on?
For them, it was exactly because in South Ossetia, remember the Russians moved in there and basically gave everyone Russian passports. And there's a little bit of coercion in that passport stuff when they if you want to be there, they make it like, so how Russian all of those people were in South Ossetia is not clear. And remember, what's his name? What was his name? Saakashvili?
Saakashvili, yeah.
He was out of his mind. he was not a stable person. Actually, I think he was clinically depressed. I think he might have been, what's that when people get depressed and then they get hyper?
Manic depressive.
I think he might have been manic depressive.
Right.
And so he was acting at a point that was irrational. But the Russian response there, I think, was more, they took the opportunity in 2008 during a political period where, remember at that time, Bush and Putin the relations weren't so bad. And that was kind of a critical moment where they kind of moved in. That changed a lot of things. I honestly, I can't say I really understand, because you got so many different narratives. Were the Georgians really doing this and that? But you see how the Russian narrative, they take that narrative and they applied it again in Crimea. Then they applied it in Ukraine. Now they're trying to apply it in Transnistria. This is a narrative that the Russian people love,
right? Because
it brings them back to the Great Patriotic War, where we're saving our people.
Okay.
And when I lived in Russia, it's that whole connection to them and the whole Great Patriotic War, I would say it's almost pathological. It's not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they reenact, people going off to war, and it's like it's an obsession with them. It's like really deep part of their mythology. And if you look at exactly what happened, remember they are eliminated. Like they passed. Have you seen those laws they passed in Russia where you can't talk about events between that period when the Russians invaded Poland and when the Germans invaded? I can't remember how long it was, but you know that period I'm talking about,
right? Yeah. So you can't
between the Ribbentrop-Molotov thing. Yeah, they've actually passed laws where you can't discuss what happened in that period.
Right.
The massacre in Poland, how they killed 20,000 intellectuals, they just murdered them all. Like this is not all just beautiful and lovely. So they create this mythology, and then they use that very powerfully to get people connected. So there's something kind of dark about that.
Right.
You could feel it now.
Yeah, because in the presentation I put it together because I've been sort of following the situation in Ukraine since 2014. I remember the Orange Revolution back, and it seemed, sort of a pivotal place to understand. So I then saw people get drawn very quickly into a narrative from the Western media, and I was aware. So I wanted to, I suppose, highlight NATO and the West's role in stoking the fires. But I was aware maybe the weak point of the presentation was I didn't necessarily look at it. It was definitely not looking through an anti-Russian lens or a lens that was critical of Putin, if you like.
Right. And that's one thing that, like, for example, when you discussed what happened in Odessa, that probably was that group that they probably did. But remember, the Russians were stoking in Kherson, in Lugansk and Donetsk. That was all them. I mean, they went in and provoked all that.
Right.
They were unsuccessful in Mariupol, unsuccessful in Odessa, unsuccessful in Kharkov, unsuccessful in Kherson, but they made it work in Donetsk and Lugansk. And then that war went on for, till today.
Yeah, well, still, really, this war began in 2014, didn't it?
That was completely funded by them,
totally
funded by them. There was a really interesting case, a really funny case, where somebody in Russia got arrested for corruption with the military. And in the documents, it showed that they were sending, I think it was beds, I don't know, some sort of military equipment to the Donbass. And it was published online, and they had to take it down. So, I mean, remember, Russia was funding this thing 100%. So, it's that part, I think that's one thing that has to be clear. I mean, they created that and promoted it. If they hadn't have done that, that would have been the revolution, the revolution would have ended, and you would have had an integral Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's two sides to that story.
Yeah. Very challenging to disentangle.
So, and I think that's one problem we've had, that a lot of us follow certain people in the media, and it was clear that the narrative had to continue. That there's been a lot of people having a hard time pivoting. It's like, I'm in this lane. Can I really change lanes? Can the other side sometimes be right? Who are we dealing with?
Yeah.
Because very few people I know have actually lived in Russia. When you hear people who've lived in Russia talk about this, it's a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not a totalitarian state, but it's pretty authoritarian.
Mm.
You know, I mean, imagine you go to a protest, and this is a lot of things you don't hear in the news. The next day, they call you in HR and they say you can't work here anymore. You're done. You know, I mean, it's a tough place.
It's interesting.
Tough place.
It's interesting what you say
coming
about
to your office and saying, "Do you support the special military operation?"
And there's a sense of justification of this, that they are under attack from some kind of Illuminati group.
Yeah,
it's interesting that you say that. I read David Rockefeller's biography a while back, and he recalls on his visit to Russia, the Politburo thought that he ran the United States in a very direct, not at all subtle way, where he would walk into Nixon's office and say, "This is the way it's going to be," and that was it. And Rockefeller was shocked by this, but they were reading John Birch Society conspiracy literature about how David Rockefeller is the spider at the center of every web. He is the kingpin. So they thought that Rockefeller could just get them special favored nation status in trading and all sorts. And he said they didn't understand the complexity of the system because it was more top down there. And he was aghast. Now I think that David Rockefeller, is immensely powerful, but in a slightly more subtle way than that. He did have influence, but I don't think he was slamming his fist on the desk in the Oval Office.
Yeah, and one of the things, a lot of these people who like to believe in these types of, the Illuminati and stuff, have never worked in organizations, in big organizations. Have never been, negotiating with. You've been in an organization where you're talking with the CEO, the CEO. You know what I mean? Like, try and get something done. Try and get anything done in a big organization. You're gonna say David Rockefeller or Bill Gates runs the world? No. It's not. It's never that simple.
No, okay, but it's interesting that seems to be something in the Russian mindset that's then they see themselves as holy Russia and defending the world against wokeism and so. Where do you think they are in relation to the kind of Great Reset narrative? Because I've heard discussions on this that people taking very different positions on Russia and the ultimate goal of Russia, and with Vladimir Putin being one of the Davos young leaders and so on. And how do you see them as like Russia's agenda there? Would they like to have that level of control over the population, but still being a separate entity from the Western power structure?
I think it's as easy as looking at Dugin. You look at Dugin's work, and it's absolutely clear. Alexander Dugin. You see exactly what they think of the world and what their worldview is, and that's their worldview. And it is that straightforward. I think he lays it out. It's this Eurasian model. There will be a Eurasian great power, and it'll be a multipolar world. So the seafaring nations, the West, they're a traditional agricultural land-based society, and they need to defend their values, their culture, etc. I think that if you listen to Dugin, you kind of, for me, that's when it clicked. I was like, I can see, and it's Dugin, and you see his thinking in many ways in Russia. There's versions of his. I remember when I was there, I had a friend who brought me these tapes. It was called General Petrov. They're about it's on YouTube. You can try. If you go put General Petrov, you'll see these videos. I think there's like 50 of them. And they give this sort of vision of world history that's very Dugin-esque, but it's a general explaining to you, not what the history book said, but what really happened from this very sort of Eurasian, they're all against us kind of worldview. And I think that's the way they see it. I mean, there are people, like if you ask your typical Russian, your typical Russian who supports the special military operation, who, Go Z team. You ask him about Navalny, for example. They will tell you that the Americans went in there, poisoned Navalny, and it was all just a stunt. It was all a stunt.
Right.
And I mean, I'm sorry. Have you seen the video that Navalny made of? I'm sure you've seen it, where they shows how he was poisoned. I mean, come on, this was the FSB. It's clearly the FSB doing a half-assed job, which is also very, kind of typical of them. And even the Ukraine operation really is a half-assed operation of the FSB.
Right.
Full of corruption. I mean, Putin thought that the FSB was going to go in there and the GRU and pay off all these police chiefs, mayors, but they had it all ready. The FSB was stealing all this money. They weren't giving the Ukrainians the money. They were stealing it, writing reports saying, yeah, we're paying this guy. So when Putin says, okay, let's go, they're like, what? You're really going to do this? They moved in and the police chiefs hadn't been paid off. And the ones that maybe were paid off got a little nervous and said, you know what? If you guys don't win, these guys are going to kill me. So I'm not on your team anymore. And then the whole thing collapsed. I mean, that's part of, how it was done.
So this, I imagine even since 2016, this Russian attitude to the West must have intensified as more of woke culture has emerged since then. I don't even remember it being a big thing until about 2015, and then it exploded onto our screen since then.
Yes, this was a major issue for them, and that was been promoted with them. When I first got to Russia, I remember people were very interested in the West. They wanted to travel. The archives, remember, the archives were opened in the mid-90s, the KGB archives. People were looking in, seeing exactly what happened. The area where I live, I mean, there were some horrific things, and people were actually seeing the amount of people who died, family members who were killed. All of a sudden, in the early 2000s, the archives get shut, and people start talking about, I remember friends who were pretty open-minded saying, in Australia, everyone's gay. And I was like, what? Or gay Europa. Everything in Europe is gay. And this was promoted from the Kremlin of this idea of our values against their values.
Right.
And it became very kind of xenophobic, kind of weird, I remember how they hated Obama. Obama was hated, despised.
Was that because of anything he did in particular with regard to Russia? I don't know how they feel about Clinton, say, right? Because he was the president when the whole ransacking of the Russian economy went on.
And that's what they really should have been angry about.
Right.
I mean, that period in the 90s was, when Harvard went there, and how much those guys stole, and how they taught them how to trade commodities and just, make a killing. The shares for, you're not getting paid, but, give me those shares you have and I'll pay your salary. That's how all those companies were taken over. I mean, they just stole the whole country, and they taught them how to do that. And what they most hate about Clinton, though, was the bombing of in Serbia. For them, and I have a very close friend who's a good journalist, interviewed Yeltsin, and she told me that was the point when they completely lost faith in the West. And from our point of view, not that I was that informed at the time, but they'll never discuss what the Serbians were doing to the Bosnians, So I never saw it as so clear cut as this was a horrible, disrespectful act to Orthodox culture. I thought, but what's going on with, I remember as a kid watching Romeo and Juliet in Sarajevo. It was a beautiful documentary about those. I don't know if you remember that famous picture of the Bosnian girl and the Serbian guy who were shot, and the two bodies were on top of each other.
No, I don't. No.
Oh, it's a beautiful documentary. And it just talks about what was going on in Sarajevo. It was horrible. So you only hear that one side of it. So they hated Clinton for that. Really hated him for that.
Right. And Obama, I remember the Sochi Olympics, it got quite heated then, and there was a lot of, that's when a lot of criticism of Russia's policies towards homosexuality started to be spoken about a lot in the media. I've heard from people involved in the US administration at the time that was genuinely a hot button issue that a lot of people felt very passionately about. So that seemed to be a point of division arising then. Is that the kind of reason why they dislike Obama?
Yeah, and the Obama administration, I think sometimes was very heavy-handed with these types of issues. But at the same time, they didn't mind bombing Libya or, starting war in Syria. So there was an enormous amount of hypocrisy there.
Yeah.
And for the Russians, the Olympics for them, that was important, that Olympics. And if you watch the Western coverage of it, it was just, they from the get-go, they were out to criticize Sochi, the Olympics. And remember, I was talking to a friend of mine who said, Putin's not going to do Ukraine. And I said, wait till February, not 24th, 21st. On the 21st, that's when Putin gave a speech. That's when the troops moved into Lugansk and Donbass, no? They moved into in Lugansk and Donetsk. The Russians moved in, and that night, he gave a televised kind of speech. And I said, watch this, the 21st is when he's going to do it. Because remember, during the Sochi Olympics, that's on the 21st is when Yanukovych left. And that's the day. So during the Sochi Olympics, which for Putin was the big, for the Russians, the Olympics is a very, very big thing. They pulled it off right in his face on that day.
Yeah.
And that did not, having done that on the 21st for me was something that was personal. With Putin, Ukraine, I think people don't talk about this. It's very personal for him. Very personal.
Well, I got that sense watching his speech on it. I was reading the translation, but it's much better to watch it than just to read a transcript, because that comes through, the sense of anger, sense of passion about this issue. It's not like watching a Western president speak, a US president speak.
And remember, for him, I think people now understand how important Ukraine is to Russia, historically, culturally, religiously. We all know that. I don't have to go through that. Remember, on his big day, I think it was 2 days before the closing ceremony, he loses Kiev, loses it. So, in chess, that's your queen. If Moscow's your king, Kiev is your queen. He loses his queen on, 3 days before the closing ceremony in Sochi. They truly rained on his party. And that was not lost on him. I remember talking to, let's just say somebody in the intelligence community from their side. And I asked him about that. I said, he said, well, this, that, and the other thing. I said, but aren't you underestimating your enemy a little bit? Because, they took Kiev from you 3 days before the closing ceremony. This guy's, you should have seen the smoke coming out of his ears. I wanted to give him a little, those type of people there. I'm sure you've met a few. But to throw that one at him, oh my God, I thought he was going to explode. I said, they're not that dumb, huh? Even they may be gay, but they're not stupid. Yeah.
Okay, coming around then back to the Twilight of the Archons, what message would you hope people would take from that whole documentary on the nature of the financial system, on the nature of consumerism and materialism, and ultimately about the nature of our true identity and consciousness?
I think it is. We rarely ask that fundamental question, and I know you have a background in sort of non-dual advice.
Yeah, that's my background. Yeah.
And I think it takes a long time for many of us who've been on different spiritual paths to get to the point where we ask ourselves that fundamental question. Like, what am I? Who am I? And once you get to that question, I think things do seem to coalesce a little bit more. No, there's a shift when that question becomes the focus. But it's difficult to get there. No, it's not. It's not an easy place to arrive. No? And the same thing about how the world works. When you want to understand how the world works, can you understand anything about politics, economics, history, if we don't understand what money is? I ask kids. I teach A-level economics. So, you got the 17-year-old, 18-year-old who's studying their A-levels for economics, and they all want to make money. And the first question I ask them in class is, so you want money? Yes. What is it? And they fumble. And I said, well, shouldn't you understand what it is? You know the features of it, but do you really understand exactly what it is? And I think when you understand what money is, it can kind of reorient your view toward the physical world. And on the spiritual level, I think you have to reach that fundamental question. And I tried to poke at it a little bit in the film. If you can get to that question, you can sort of cut through a lot of nonsense in our culture.
Right. It's interesting. To me, the comparison. I was interested in the question of why is this thing called conspirituality a thing? Why is there a parallel between people interested in spirituality, involved in that, and people interested in conspiracy? Not just in conspiracy though, but in maybe that and a deeper understanding of the functionings of the material world. I think it's something about awareness and an ability that some people have or gravitate towards, being able to ask the very fundamental questions, like what's the axiom upon which all this is based, and to turn one's attention within and look back to one's own center and say, well, what's the axiom upon which I am based? Where is the me thought in here? And that same kind of penetrating awareness projected out into the world, into the financial system, ends with the question of what is money, projected onto the state, ends at what's the justification for this institution? And then you have anarchism arising. Well, geopolitically, what's gone on in history? What are the power plays here that have been made, and who's really pulling the strings? And so it's this, to me, there's a parallel between the spiritual and the temporal understanding.
Exactly, and that's what I was trying to explore. Let's say, and it's not easy, I mean, it's not. And that's why I really like the work you've done, because you look at kind of both sides of it. And it's very easy to fall off the cliff on either end, to get lost in the conspiracy stuff.
Yeah.
That becomes just narcissistic nonsense. And then on the spiritual side, to kind of go off and lose that laser focus, And if you can keep that laser focus on both sides, where do you actually arrive? I'm not, and I don't claim to be there yet. So, but I'm not sure if they both come together. And that's something I really wanted to ask you. Where do you think, what does your intuition say? What would be the view once you get there? Would it just be, it's all a bunch of nonsense and you'd laugh at it? It would be like a joke.
I think I'm a bit of a pluralist, really. So I think that you probably have multiple ways of looking at it. So on one hand, it's a bunch of nonsense and you'd have to have a laugh and a joke about it or you go mad. So at the same time, it's deadly serious and really important, and another time at the same time again not important at all. It is, everything's arising in, if you go to that pure place of everything's a dream, my essential identity isn't in the dream, it's the thing that's witnessing the dream, then you can be like what do they say, to come back to the Gnostics, the Gospel of Judas, where it's really Judas is on the crucifix, not Jesus stood in a cave laughing. Okay, so makes Jesus look rather sadistic, but it's allegorically like the false limited self, the appearance of who we are. That's Judas, and he's suffering as you suffer in the world, whereas Jesus is our true essential essence, our identity. So he's laughing in a cave, but at the same time, there's terrible suffering. So I think that's it. I think it's many things at once. I don't think one position is the true one, if you like. I think you need that combination of them.
But the identity, when we identify with a lot of these ideas, I think that's when we get sucked in. The same with ourselves. When we identify with this self that you kind of battle with, like, really, it's that dance you also get, I think, and it's so, we can be so manipulated by it. Think of like patriotic urge. Yeah. It's so easy to play with people that way. And the lack of courage that people have in actually looking in the mirror. It's so easy to throw them the patriotic bone and, have to get them all running.
Something I've been intrigued to see over the past few years is how easy it seems for the Archons, whatever the Archons are, the power structures, to direct human attention and tell a massive proportion of the population what is important to care about this week and what we can ignore altogether. So suddenly COVID became this central important thing, and the ramifications of lockdowns, whether 4 or 5 million people starve in India because of them, that doesn't matter. That they're not worthy victims all of a sudden, because the thing you must feel compassion for is COVID victims and only COVID victims. And then we see the same thing, that all of a sudden everyone's Facebook profile is blue and yellow for Ukraine, because that's the thing this week. But Yemen, where hundreds of thousands of people died in a war that's actually backed fully, to the extent they're effectively fighting in it, by countries that most of us live in, the US or the UK. But that wasn't important. There was no direction. The state said, no, that's not important. Don't put your attention on that. And the ability of these Archontic forces to take human attentions like this, place it here, place it here, place it here, that's amazing to me.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Like I was having breakfast today with a friend of mine who's Libyan, and Lavrov the other day said, "Well, you worry about the Ukraine war, but look at what happened in Libya. They're still fighting. You guys started that. Nobody cares." And he was laughing at me. He was like, "You know how long we had this war going on? No one cares. You never hear anyone talk about the war in Libya. Last 3 days ago, they were at the brink of starting another battle. Nobody cares."
No, I think part of it, when I speak to people, some people are just genuinely unaware. Like, my thought is British people born post the Second World War don't have a lot of reason to be fearful of the state. They've had a pretty good relationship with the state. And, if you keep your head down, work hard in this country, now in England, in the UK, I'm just outside of it, but there, you probably had a good life since World War II, and no one blames the state for World War II. They see that as a thing that was necessary, and we stood up to Hitler. So really, you've got to go back to the 1930s to have people who really felt like they were dumped upon in like appalling working conditions, coming home to terrible living conditions. And it's been kind of okay since then. So I think there's a lot of people who just, the BBC says what's going on in the world, and if it says there's a big crisis in Ukraine, there's a big crisis in Ukraine, and if it doesn't say there's one in Yemen, then there isn't one in Yemen. And Libya, that was all sorted out 10 years ago. So I think there's that, but it also seems to be more than that, like, because I can almost feel this like a wave, like I'm not unaffected by it, where I can feel myself suddenly being pulled more into like where it feels like the Ukraine is more pressing than Yemen, even though I know it isn't. It's almost like this wave of psychic energy passes through us all and carries our attention off, and it's a weird phenomenon.
But I think, and actually, I having breakfast with my Libyan friend this morning, he said, nobody cares about Libya, and you're all worried about Ukraine. And what's the difference? And I said, there is one difference. First of all, my ancestor, like the European wars affected my family directly. No. And we killed, 100 million people between 1914 and 1945. Yeah. And so that affects us in a way that a war in Yemen or a war in Libya is not going to affect us psychically. And I think that part is true, that there's something there that we feel that maybe for us is more relevant than, for example, war in Libya.
I agree. I to a good extent, I agree with that. I think it's true that it's kind of silly to pretend that geographic proximity has no bearing on how you're going to react to a crisis, and even a humanitarian crisis. Of course, like, if my neighbor's house catches fire, I'm going to be more concerned about that than someone 100 miles away, even though I can objectively say, well, it's, the same thing. But it seems to go beyond that to me, because people are expressing this great level of humanitarian care and concern for the plight of Ukrainians in a way that it never occurred to them with Yemen or Libya.
Yeah. No, and that is so true. And it's difficult because you think, what's the difference? No, I mean, I can be in Libya if I just start driving in 7 hours.
Wow.
And so I have students who are traumatized from that war, Libyan students who you can tell have been, have certain trauma, and you think, wow, I met an Iraqi girl the other day. It was, I was having a drink, and she was telling me, it was horrible. So I know exactly what you mean, but I don't think we can change. We can say, well, there's something wrong with that. Yeah, but we can't change what affects us and how we feel as humans. And this is a bit of a tangent, but I think there really is something to generational theory. The fourth turning. Are you familiar with that whole theory of the different generations?
No, not a fourth turn. No, I don't think what I think is what you're. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, the fourth turning is just a generational theory by Strauss and Ho, that talks about every generation is about 20 years. So you have, just think of it as spring, summer, fall, winter. The last winter we had was 4 generations ago.
Right.
And you see in U.S. history, you have the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the Second World War, and we're at that point again. It's about every 85 years.
Yeah.
And I think it's almost like the seasons that we feel like the war in Yemen was not something that we should pay attention to because but what's going on now, I think a lot of people feel this, that it's like, oh my God, yeah, we have a very big storm coming and this is dangerous.
Yeah, that's true. Objectively,
and I think that, and I don't think it's from a moral sense or an ethical sense. It's, oh shit, this is really serious. I think that's what's happening.
Well, yeah. I mean, if it wasn't for the presence of nuclear weapons, I would think, okay, Europe is headed into another substantial war.
Yeah.
I think that the nukes obviously put a block on that and make people act with more caution. But yeah, this would be, I mean, I think Europe would probably have a hot war a long time ago now, absent for the nukes. But no, this would, you would definitely be on the way there, because you look at the kind of politicians, there'd be no incentive to calm the thing down. This would be escalating towards, like deployment of ground forces.
I mean, I think you're younger than I am, so you probably don't really remember the Cold War.
No, not really. I mean, one of my early memories is this thing called the Berlin Wall coming down. And okay, well, what's that about? And then I remember West Germany winning the World Cup in 1990 and wondering why it's West Germany. And then they were Germany a few years later. So that's I don't remember it, no, as it happened, really.
But like, I remember the Cold War, and I remember the TV doing that thing where, in the case of emergency and the whole idea of a nuclear war, it was kind of a thing for us to watch important politicians, generals, and everything pretty openly discuss what would happen if the Russians used a tactical nuke. I'm like, what? It's shocking to hear these people say, well, yeah, it's a possibility. I wouldn't rule it out. When I was a teenager, when one use of a nuke meant that was it, the world was over. And now to hear people say, yeah, it's possible. What would we do if you used a tactical nuke? Da, 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 blah, blah, blah. It's a little terrifying. You can feel that something has changed. There's a shift here. And I just hope that we're not being prepared for, something catastrophic.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous moment. I think it's the most dangerous moment in my lifetime, without a doubt.
Yeah, I think that must be objectively the case. For in terms of, obviously, if you're in Iraq and a bomb drops on your head, that's a dangerous moment for you. But in terms of like global security, yeah.
And just one last thing, that from that generational theory, you should look into it. It's very interesting. If you just read the last chapter, the fourth turning, it talks about what a fourth turning is like. It's all the old institutions collapse and decay, and new ones have to emerge. Like in 1945, you had the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, Bretton Woods, all these things come into play, work really well for about 4 generations, and then they collapse, they lose meaning. People lose faith in institutions, and we're at that point. And one thing, all of my life, our leaders were a great generation. And they had a different attitude toward war. It was a very different view of what war was and what nuclear war meant. And I think some of the people now in power don't have that experience of just total war. And you see them talk about it, let's send more guns to Ukraine. And you see some of the videos on Twitter of people being killed, people cheering. It's a very strange sensation. Yeah,
it is. Like they say that in the UK, that when the First World War was announced, people cheered, and the Second World War, people groaned. And yes. The Spanish-American War, apparently it was all the youngsters like Theodore Roosevelt who hadn't seen the Civil War, who wanted to go charging in, whereas McKinley was more reticent, having gone through it. He yielded in the end. But I think that the generational thing, I'm sure there's something in that, right? I'm sure that there are these patterns that play out over time. I never really found I could decipher them. I have no doubt they're there. Yeah.
There seems to be a cycle to this, and it's almost like I can just feel it in my bones that we're getting sucked into something. And it's scary, and I'm not really sure how to approach it, because there's 2 approaches to it. I think one is do everything you can to stop it, and that's a very logical sort of reaction. And the other one is, you know what? It's like you're in prison and you got to pick sides, Like,
well, okay, I'll end on this question then, what's your sense of hope for the world, and has it been changed by recent events? Because I think people have always fallen into different camps of this. Like, so people involved in spirituality or some kind of geopolitics or conspiracy theory, there's a camp that have always believed that we're moving towards a kind of global awakening. And I think there was reason to be hopeful of that for a while. It's like, hey, we've got the internet now, we can write articles. Hey, we've got you, we can put videos up and document. Imagine if the whole world sees documentaries on 9/11 and the JFK assassination and Santa Bundry systems. There was 10, 15 years ago, if you weren't too jaded, you could really have reason to be hopeful that we're having this global revolution. And what I see is a lot more people now, I think, post-COVID have said, oh, wow, yeah, actually a lot of people really just want to go along with whatever the state tells them. They are not interested. They have access to the information. They don't want to use it. And there's a shift from thinking about this as a revolutionary movement to more of a secessionist movement, to more of like, how do we kind of get away from these people and survive in whatever's coming as they drag them, as you're saying, like, what are these great cycles is going to take place and the world's going to go into a period of chaos? How do we survive and ensure our institutions survive that? What's your position on that kind of spectrum? And has it changed over the past few years of COVID and everything?
I just have to say that, I mean, I began working in the internet in the late 90s. I don't know if you remember that period, but it was a fabulous period. I mean, it was such a different feeling, like, oh my God, we've got it all figured out. And to see that decay into the 9/11 and then the whole early 2000s, the financial collapse, COVID, this, that, and the other thing, it's like everything is speeding up. And I mean, do you use Twitter?
I don't use Twitter. I've never used Twitter. That's a step too far for me.
I remember I got onto Twitter and it fascinated me for a while, but I can't go near it. It's like going near. Did you ever drink too much, some sort of alcohol, and the next day you get that smell?
That has happened, yes.
Yeah, that's how I feel now when I even see anything related to Facebook, Twitter. I can't engage in it. I really think we're at a point where, like you said, there's a decay in all of our institutions, in our belief systems. And we have to reach sort of that dark point where it seems hopeless before something new has to emerge. Whatever it is, it's not here now. And I have that feeling like there's nowhere to turn. Nowhere. Yeah. I mean, think about it. You have people who think Putin is the answer. I mean, are you fucking kidding? And then other people think Joe Biden and all these lunatics. No, the Europeans are going to save us. It's like, I wish I could kind of say something hopeful, but it really is that moment where it feels like there's nowhere to turn. And that we have to wait for this to just fall under its own weight, and hopefully something will come out on the other end. But I don't see, I don't know what it is yet.
Yeah, it feels to me like there's not a will to construct something from where we're at. Like, I don't know if it's worse than it ever was, but when I look at American media now, it's very much this selling of hatred of the other is so obvious, of right-wingers, left-wingers, right-wingers, and just these different corporations telling the population to hate the other 50% of the population, and they make a book of that. And there seems like a lot of people buying into that, where it does feel like there's a low-level civil war broken out in the States. It just hasn't gone to violence, but it's when you're not in any way interested in engaging with other people, but you live in the same political system, then you are essentially in a kind of warfare then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really do worry about this. Have we hacked ourselves? So have we allowed these technologies to hack our brains? And are we permanently damaged on a cultural level? That really does worry me. Like, for example, I use this phone. I will not use a smartphone. It was just something when I leave, I'm on the internet when I'm home, but when I leave the house, I don't want to be connected to the internet. And when you do that, I highly encourage everyone, just do it for 3 days and watch people and watch how when you're not with a phone and you just watch people use their phones, you really begin to wonder, holy shit, they're all addicted to this thing. and that information is this completely distorting our view of the world, how we act, how we interact politically, socially, culturally. So that worries me a lot. That's one thing I'm seriously worried about.
Okay, Robert, I'm searching for something positive to end on. I don't know if I'm going to get there, so maybe just have you back on.
I mean, the only thing I could say is on the spiritual level, I do have hope, but it's not, and I don't want to go into that part now, but I mean, that's where I find solace. And in that place, it's just a bunch of bullshit anyway, right?
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, man.